ropes burned her wrists as the Lakota warrior leaned close, his dark eyes burning with hatred that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. War paint streaked his bronze skin in fierce patterns of blue and black, and eagle feathers danced in his long hair as the prairie wind whispered promises of death. "I will break you," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 ancestral spirits, "as your people broke my sister." But Elena Brooks, school teacher from Colorado, with dirt on her torn dress and fire in her green eyes, looked right back at him and said something in perfect Lakota that made every warrior in the camp fall silent. The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning, changing everything in that single breathless moment. "You see, this isn't just another tale of captive and captor. This is the story of how revenge became redemption, how hatred transformed into the most unexpected love, and how two souls from different worlds discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from breaking someone, but from learning to heal together." The year was 1876, and the American frontier was a place where cultures clashed like storm clouds, where misunderstanding bred violence, and where the smallest act of compassion could change the course of history. Elena had been traveling to California to start a new life, fleeing the suffocating expectations of Eastern society. She wanted to teach children to make a difference, to find her own path in a world that told women their place was silent and small. Lakota, whose name meant friend to everyone but whose heart had turned to stone, was a warrior driven by grief so deep it threatened to consume not just him, but everyone around him. His sister, gentle Elena, had been killed in a cavalry raid while trying to broker peace between their people and the encroaching settlers. The soldiers claimed she was armed. She had been carrying nothing but a white flag in hope for tomorrow. Now, as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, their worlds were about to collide in ways neither could have imagined. What started as a quest for vengeance would become something far more powerful. A bridge between two peoples built not with treaties or guns, but with understanding, courage, and a love that refused to recognize the boundaries others had drawn. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, where dust clouds rose on the horizon and gunshots echoed across the vast expanse of the American plains. Let's start where everything changed, where a promise to break became a vow to heal, and where two hearts discovered that sometimes the enemy's face looks surprisingly like home. This is Elena and Lakota's story, a tale of the Wild West that proves love doesn't see color, culture, or the scars of the past. It sees only the possibility of tomorrow, written in starlight and sealed with the kind of courage that can transform hatred into hope. The morning sun blazed mercilessly across the Colorado plains when Elena Brooks first heard the thundering of hoof-beats that would change her life forever. She had been riding in the supply wagon with Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, discussing lesson plans for the California school where Elena hoped to teach. The wagon train had been making good time toward Fort Collins, and the previous day's river crossing had lifted everyone's spirits. Then came the gunshots. Indians, someone screamed, and chaos erupted like a prairie fire. Elena watched in horror as blue-uniformed cavalry soldiers charged through their peaceful caravan, guns blazing, mistaking their group for hostile raiders in the early morning light. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. White soldiers attacking white settlers in their zeal to find enemies. Mrs. Henderson's scream was cut short by a stray bullet. Elena dove from the wagon as horses reared and men shouted conflicting orders. The world became a blur of dust, blood, and terror. When the gun's smoke finally cleared, half their party lay motionless on the trampled grass, and the cavalry had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, apparently realizing their deadly mistake. Elena knelt beside Mrs. Henderson, checking for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find. That's when she heard them, real Lakota warriors approaching from the ridge drawn by the gunfire. Unlike the chaotic cavalry charge, their approach was measured, purposeful, like wolves closing in on wounded prey. The survivors, 3 women and an old man, huddled together as the warriors descended. Elena counted 12 riders, their faces painted for war, weapons gleaming in the harsh sunlight. At their head rode a man who commanded attention without saying a word. He was tall, powerfully built, with shoulders that spoke of years handling war horses and drawing powerful bows. His war paint was more elaborate than the others. Blue streaks that followed the strong lines of his cheekbones, black marks that made his dark eyes seem even more intense. This was Lakota, though Elena didn't know his name yet. She only knew that when his gaze fell on her, kneeling there in her blood-stained blue dress with her blonde hair tumbling from its careful arrangement, something shifted in the air between them. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition, the way two storms recognize each other on the horizon. "You," he said in accented English, pointing directly at her. His voice was deep, controlled, carrying authority, that made the other warriors straighten in their saddles. "You come." Elena's chin lifted in defiance that surprised even her. "I'm not going anywhere with you." A murmur ran through the Lakota warriors. It wasn't just her refusal that shocked them. White captives always refused at first. It was the steadiness in her voice, the way she looked directly at their leader instead of cowering. Most white women fainted or wept hysterically when faced with Lakota warriors. This one stood her ground like she was discussing weather. Lakota swung down from his horse with fluid grace. Up close, Elena could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps late 20s, but his eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen too much death, too much loss. He walked toward her with a confident stride of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Your people," he said, gesturing toward the bodies scattered across the grass. "They kill always. They kill. Now you come. Learn what it means to lose." "These weren't my people," Elena said firmly, surprising herself with her calm tone. "Those were soldiers who attacked us by mistake. We're just travelers, same as your families traveling these lands." Something flickered in Lakota's eyes. Surprised perhaps at her distinguishing between soldiers and civilians, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold mask of someone who'd made peace with necessary cruelty. He stepped closer until Elena could smell the sage smoke in his hair, could see the intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt. "You speak of family," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My sister was family. Gentle Elena, who spoke your language, who wanted peace between our peoples. Your soldiers killed her while she carried a white flag." Elena's heart clenched at the raw pain in his voice, but she didn't back down. "Then you know how it feels to lose someone innocent. Why would you want to create more of that pain?" For a moment, just a moment, something human flickered in those dark eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold determination of a man on a mission he couldn't abandon. "Because," he said, reaching out to touch her face with fingers that were surprisingly gentle despite the threat in his words, "pain is the only teacher that makes lessons permanent. I will break you, white woman, as your people broke my sister. You will know what it means to have everything taken away." Elena jerked back from his touch, but she didn't look away. "What's your name, warrior?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Lakota." "Well, Lakota," Elena said, pronouncing it perfectly with the subtle tonal shift that indicated respect. "Changes." The silence that followed was absolute. Every warrior stared at Elena as if she'd just sprouted wings. Lakota's face went completely blank, his carefully controlled expression cracking for the first time. She had spoken perfect Lakota with the accent of someone who'd learned it properly formally. What she'd said roughly translated to: "The day you think grief gives you the right to destroy innocence is the day you become what you hate." But the fact that she could speak their language at all was staggering. White women didn't learn Lakota. They didn't understand the nuances of pronunciation that could change meaning entirely. They certainly didn't quote what sounded suspiciously like something an elder might say. Lakota stared at her for a long moment, his worldview tilting on its axis. Then, almost against his will, one corner of his mouth quirked up in what might have been respect. "You are full of surprises, Elena Brooks," he said, somehow knowing her name, though she'd never spoken it. "This will make breaking you much more interesting." He turned to his warriors and spoke rapidly in Lakota. Elena understood every word, though she kept her face carefully blank. He was telling them to take her back to camp, to treat her as valuable prisoner, not common captive. She was to be his personal responsibility, his project in pain and education. As strong hands lifted her onto a horse, Elena's mind raced. She learned Lakota from a friendly tribe near her school in Colorado, where she'd helped nurse children through a winter sickness. She'd never imagined that knowledge would save her life or complicate it so thoroughly. Takot mounted his warhorse and moved beside her. "Where did you learn our language?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a curiosity he couldn't quite hide. Elena looked straight ahead. "From people who trusted me not to use it as a weapon." "And yet," Takakota said, "you just used it as exactly that." As they rode toward the distant Lakota camp, Elena realized she just entered into something far more complex than simple captivity. She challenged a grieving warrior in his own language, quoted his people's wisdom back to him, and somehow earned his attention rather than his quick disposal. But what terrified her most wasn't Takakota's promise to break her. It was the realization that beneath his war paint and grief, beneath his carefully constructed armor of hatred, she'd glimpsed something that looked dangerously like a kindred spirit. The game between them had begun, though neither yet understood the rules or realized that they were both already changing. The Lakota camp spread across a valley like a living thing. Dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of wisdom. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played with miniature bows and women worked hides with practiced efficiency. It would have been beautiful if Elena hadn't been brought here as a prisoner. Takakota led her through the camp in silence, and Elena felt dozens of eyes tracking their progress. Some looks held curiosity, others suspicion, but all carried the weight of loss that seemed to permeate this place like smoke. These people had suffered, she realized. They all had the same carefully controlled expression Takakota wore, the look of those who'd learned to bury their pain deep. He stopped before a type larger than the others, its hide walls painted with intricate scenes of horses and eagles. "You will stay here," he said, dismounting and pulling her down with hands that were firm but not cruel. "Try to run and my warriors will bring you back. Try to harm anyone and I will forget my promise to break you slowly." Elena steadied herself, meeting his gaze. "What exactly does breaking me slowly entail?" Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise again at her directness. Most captives begged or wept or tried to bargain. This white woman asked practical questions like she was negotiating business terms. "You will work," he said. "Hard work from sunrise to sunset. You will eat what we give you, sleep where we tell you, speak only when spoken to. You will learn what it means to have no choices, no control over your own life." And then, Takakota said, stepping closer until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "When your spirit is properly educated, you will understand what my sister felt in her final moments." Elena considered this. "And after I understand, what then, Takakota? Do you kill me? Trade me? What's the end of this story you're writing?" The question clearly unsettled him. Elena could see him struggling with it, his jaw tightening. "That depends on how well you learn." An elderly woman emerged from the painted teepee. Small, weathered with silver hair braided with beads and feathers. Her eyes were sharp as obsidian chips, missing nothing as they moved between Elena and Takakota. When she spoke, it was in rapid Lakota. "Grandmother," Takakota replied in English, clearly for Elena's benefit. "This is the white woman. She will stay here." The old woman, his grandmother Elena, realized, circled her slowly, studying her like a horse trader, evaluating stock. Elena stood still, instinctively, understanding this was some kind of test. The woman's gnarled fingers touched Elena's hands, examined her dress, looked into her eyes with an intensity that was somehow not unkind. Then she spoke again in Lakota and Elena's breath caught. The old woman was asking Takakota why he'd brought home a woman whose spirit was already broken by her own people. "Uni," Takakota said sharply, "speak English." "Why?" his grandmother replied, switching languages with a sly smile, afraid she might understand more than you expect. Elena felt Dakota's eyes boring into her, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Let him wonder what she understood and what she didn't. Information was power, and she needed every advantage she could get. "She will work in the morning," Lakota said. "See that she has food and water, but nothing more. No blankets unless she earns them." As he turned to leave, his grandmother's voice stopped him. "The spirits have been restless lately, grandson. Last night I dreamed of a white eagle teaching our children to fly." Lakota's shoulders tensed. "Dreams are just dreams, aren't she? Are they?" The old woman's eyes shifted to Elena. "We shall see." That night, Elena sat on the hard ground inside the teepee, wrapped in her torn dress and shivering as the temperature dropped. The old woman, who'd introduced herself as Ayana, named for the same daughter Lakota had lost, had given her a bowl of thin soup and a piece of flatbread. It wasn't enough to satisfy her hunger, but it was enough to survive. Through the teepee walls, Elena could hear the sounds of the camp settling for the night. Children being called inside, horses being secured, adults discussing the day's events in low voices. It was so normal, so family-oriented that it made her chest ache with unexpected homesickness. She'd just begun to doze when the teepee flap opened and Lakota entered. In the dim light of the small fire, his war paint had been washed away, revealing a face that was younger and more vulnerable than she'd expected. He was still intimidating, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled grace of a predator. But without the paint, she could see the grief that lived in the lines around his eyes. "You're cold, Timon," he observed, settling across the fire from her. "I'm fine." "You're shivering." Elena wrapped her arms around herself. "I said, I'm fine." Lakota studied her for a long moment. "In my culture, stubbornness is considered a virtue. In yours, I believe it's called foolishness." "In my culture," Elena shot back, "we don't take innocent people prisoner to work through our grief." The words hit him like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought she'd pushed too far. Then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. "You have a sharp tongue for someone in your position." "My position? Helpless. Dependent on my mercy for your next meal, your next breath." Elena leaned forward, her green eyes flashing in the firelight. "I'm only helpless if I choose to be. And I'm only dependent on your mercy if I accept that your mercy is worth depending on." This time, Lakota did smile. A real one that transformed his entire face. "You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Elena found herself studying his hands, strong, scarred from weapons practice, but gentle when he fed small sticks to the flames. There was something almost hypnotic about watching him tend the fire, about the way the light played across his features. "Tell me about your sister," she said quietly. Lakota's hand stilled. "Why? Because if you're going to use her memory to justify tormenting me, I should at least know who she was." For a moment, Elena thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. "Ayana was light. Where I saw enemies, she saw potential friends. Where I saw threats, she saw misunderstandings. She learned English from a missionary family, not to convert, but because she believed communication could prevent bloodshed." His voice grew rougher. "She was riding to Fort Collins with a white flag when your cavalry found her. They said later they thought she was scouting for a war party. She was carrying medicine for sick children and a letter requesting a peace talk." Elena's heart clenched. "I'm sorry. Your sorrow changes nothing." "No," Elena agreed, "but understanding might." Lakota's eyes snapped to hers. "Understanding? You want me to know what loss feels like, but I already know. My parents died of cholera when I was 16. My brother was killed in the war. My fiancé died in a mining accident 6 months before our wedding." Elena's voice remained steady despite the pain threading through it. "I came west because I had nothing left in the east except memories and graves." Something shifted into Lakota's expression. "Then I know grief makes us want to hurt something," Elena interrupted. "I know it makes us want to share the pain so we're not carrying it alone. But I also know that breaking innocent people doesn't bring back the ones we've lost. It just adds more ghosts to haunt us." Lakota stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood abruptly, moving to a wooden chest in the corner of the teepee. He pulled out a thick buffalo hide and tossed it to her. "The nights are cold here," he said gruffly. "I need you healthy if you're going to work tomorrow." Elena caught the hide, its warmth and softness of blessed relief. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Lakota said, settling back by the fire. "Consider it an investment in your education." But as Elena wrapped herself in the buffalo hide and watched Lakota bank the fire for the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted between them. He was still her captor, still planning to break her spirit, but there had been something almost protective in the way he'd given her the blanket. As she drifted towards sleep, Elena found herself wondering who was really being educated here, and whether Lakota's plan to break her might end up breaking something in himself instead. The last thing she saw before a sleep claimed her was Lakota sitting vigil by the dying fire, his face thoughtful in the red glow, as if he too was beginning to realize that nothing about this situation was going to unfold the way he'd planned. Dawn came with the sound of children laughing and women beginning their daily work. Elena woke on the hard ground, muscles aching but spirit unbroken. The buffalo hide had kept her warm through the night, and she found herself grudgingly grateful to Lakota for that small mercy. He was gone when she woke, but his grandmother, Elena, was waiting with a bowl of cornmeal mush and a stern expression. "Eat quickly," the old woman said in careful English. "Takat says, you work today. We see what white woman hands can do." Elena accepted the food gratefully. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling. "What kind of work?" "Everything," Elena said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Carry water, tend fires, help with children. We see if you break first day or if you have spine like you pretend." As Elena finished eating, children began gathering around the teepee's entrance, peering at her with open curiosity. She counted 6 of them, ranging from perhaps 4 years old to early teens. Their faces were round and healthy, but Elena noticed how they stayed close to Elena, how their eyes darted to the teepee entrance as if watching for danger. "Change epi," one of the younger children whispered to another, pointing at Elena's hair. The word meant tree hair, a reference to its golden color that was rare among their people. Elena smiled at the child and spoke softly in Lakota Tokal and "Hello, cousin. How are you?" The children's eyes went wide as saucers. They burst into excited chatter, all speaking at once in rapid Lakota. Elena caught fragments. They were amazed that she could speak their language, asking each other how this was possible, wondering if she was some kind of spirit. Ayana's expression had gone very still. "Where did you learn our words, white woman?" "From the northern Cheyenne near my school," Elena said honestly. "I helped their medicine woman nurse children through a fever sickness 2 winters ago. She taught me so I could help more effectively." The old woman studied her with new interest. "You are healer. I know some healing." "Yes. Mostly herbs and setting bones, treating fevers and wounds." Before Ayana could respond, Lakota's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Enough talking. Time to work." He strode into the circle, and Elena felt the children immediately tense. This wasn't the uncle who told stories and carved toy horses. This was the war leader painted for intimidation. His face was streaked with fresh war paint, and his expression was cold as winter stone. "You will carry water from the river," he told Elena curtly. 20 trips before the sun reaches its highest point. Each bucket must be full or you start counting again." Elena looked at the large wooden buckets he indicated, then at the river, which had to be nearly a 4-mile away. 20 trips with full buckets would be exhausting work, especially for someone already weakened by stress and poor food. "And if I can't manage 20 trips, then you go without food today and try again tomorrow." Elena nodded calmly. "I understand." What she didn't say was that she'd grown up on a farm, had carried water for livestock and gardens since she was big enough to lift a bucket. This was hard work, but not impossible. She bent to lift the first bucket, testing its weight. Heavy but manageable. As she started toward the river, she heard Lakota telling Ayana to watch the white woman carefully to report any signs of defiance or attempts to escape. The walk to the river was peaceful despite her circumstances. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and wild flowers. Elena could see why the Lakota had chosen this valley. It was sheltered from wind, had good water, and would be easy to defend if necessary. As she knelt by the river to fill her bucket, Elena noticed movement in the bushes on the far bank. Her breath caught as she recognized the lean shapes of wolves, at least 4 of them, watching the camp with hungry eyes. They were thin, she realized, probably driven from their normal hunting grounds by the drought that had been affecting the area. Elena filled her bucket and headed back to camp, her mind racing. Wolves this close to a camp with children was dangerous, especially if they were hungry enough to overcome their natural fear of humans. She made her first trip successfully, pouring the water into the large storage containers the women used for cooking and drinking. Lakota watched her with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. 19 more, he said. Elena nodded and went back for the second bucket, and the third. By her 5th trip, she was beginning to feel the strain in her shoulders and back, but she pushed on. Some of the women had begun watching her work, whispering among themselves. On her 8th trip, disaster struck. Elena was returning from the river when she heard it, the terrified scream of a child from the direction of the horse corral. She dropped her bucket and ran, reaching the scene just as 4 lean wolves emerged from the tall grass, stalking toward 2 small children who'd been playing near the horses. The horses were rearing and snorting, too panicked to be much protection. The children, a boy and girl maybe 5 and 7 years old, were frozen with terror, huddled together as the lead wolf advanced with gleaming eyes and bare teeth. Elena didn't think. She grabbed a burning branch from a nearby fire pit and charged straight at the wolves, screaming at the top of her lungs and waving the flame like a weapon. "Hia King Hung, get back," she shouted in Lakota, making herself as large and threatening as possible. The wolves hesitated, confused by this unexpected challenge. The lead wolf snarled and took a step forward, but Elena thrust the burning branch toward its face. The smell of singed fur filled the air as the wolf jerked back. "King Hanya, go away." Elena roared, advancing on the pack. "There's nothing for you here." Behind her, she could hear running feet and men's voices as the camp responded to the children's screams. But Elena didn't wait for help. She kept advancing on the wolves, using the fire in her voice to drive them back toward the tall grass. The wolves, outnumbered and confused by this fierce resistance from what they had expected to be easy prey, finally turned and loped away into the prairie. Elena kept the burning branch raised until they were completely out of sight, then turned to check on the children. Both little ones were crying but unharmed. The boy, she thought his name was C.H. Hatta, wrapped his arms around her legs and babbled something in Lakota that included the word hero. SHH. Elena soothed, kneeling to comfort them both. "You're safe now." The wolves are gone. That's when she realized the entire camp had gone silent. She looked up to find dozens of people staring at her. Men, women, children, all wearing expressions of shock and something that might have been dawning respect. At the front of the crowd stood, his war paint doing nothing to hide the stunned expression on his face. His carefully planned lesson in humiliation had just been derailed by his prisoner risking her life to save Lakota children. "You dropped your bucket," he said finally, his voice strange. Elena looked back at the spilled water, then at Lakota. "I'll get another." "No," said a new voice. One of the warriors, a man called Blue Hawk who'd been openly hostile to Elena's presence, stepped forward. "You saved our children. The water can wait." Other voices joined in, speaking in Lakota. Elena understood most of it. Words of gratitude, amazement that a white captive would risk herself for Lakota children, discussions about what this meant. Lakota raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "You acted bravely, but you are still prisoner. You still have work to finish." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I know, but children are children regardless of who they belong to. I won't apologize for protecting them." Something flickered in Dakota's dark eyes. Surprise, confusion. Something that might have been approval. 17 buckets remain, he said finally. Elena nodded and went back to work. But as she walked to the river for her 9th trip, she heard the whispered conversations following her. The women were arguing about whether to help her. The children were asking if the tree-hair woman was going to stay. The men were debating what it meant that a white captive had shown such courage. Most importantly, she caught sight of Lakota walking away from the group, his shoulders tense, his stride carrying him toward the hills where he could think without an audience. Elena had just disrupted his entire worldview in the space of 5 minutes. She'd shown that white people could be brave, selfless, willing to risk themselves for others. She demonstrated that his carefully constructed narrative about white people being uniformly selfish and cruel might not be entirely accurate. As Elena filled her bucket and began the long walk back to camp, she realized that Dakota's promise to break her was starting to break something in him instead. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what needed to happen. The game between them had taken an unexpected turn, and for the first time since her capture, Elena began to believe she might survive this with both her life and her spirit intact. But more than that, she was beginning to hope that she might help heal something that had been broken long before she ever arrived. 3 days had passed since the wolf incident, and Elena could feel the entire dynamic of the camp shifting around her like sand and wind. The children now approached her freely, chattering in a mixture of English and Lakota that she answered in kind. The women included her in their work circles, teaching her their techniques for weaving and hide preparation with grudging but genuine respect. Even some of the warriors nodded acknowledgement when she passed. But Dakota had grown increasingly distant, watching her from afar with an expression that seemed a war between confusion and something darker. Elena could feel his internal struggle like a storm gathering on the horizon. That storm broke on the 4th morning, when dust clouds appeared on the eastern ridge. Elena was helping Ayana tend a cooking fire when the camp dogs began barking frantically. Warriors grabbed weapons and ran to defensive positions as scouts galloped in with urgent reports. Elena couldn't catch all the rapid Lakota, but she understood enough. Soldiers approaching, maybe 24, moving fast and hard. "Get the women and children to the hide caves," Lakota commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. Quickly and quietly, as families began gathering essential supplies for retreat, Elena found herself caught in a moment of crystalline clarity. She could flee with the women and children, probably should flee, or she could stay and face whatever was coming. The choice would define not just her immediate future, but who she chose to be in this impossible situation. Lakota appeared beside her, his face painted for war, rifle in hand. "You go with the women." "No." The word came out stronger than Elena had intended. Lakota's eyes narrowed dangerously. "This is not request, this is command." Elena met his gaze steadily. "And I'm telling you no. If soldiers are coming for me, running away just puts innocent women and children in danger. I stay." "You think they come for you?" Before Elena could answer, the thunder of hoof-beats announced the arrival of the cavalry. Elena's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Captain Morrison, a harsh man she'd met briefly at Fort Collins. Behind him rode 24 soldiers in dusty blue uniforms, all armed and looking like they expected trouble. Morrison raised his hand, signaling a halt just outside the camp's perimeter. His cold eyes swept the assembled Lakota warriors, before settling on Elena with satisfaction. "Miss Brooks," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "you're a difficult woman to find." Elena stepped forward, acutely aware of Lakota moving to her left side like a guard. "Captain Morrison, I wasn't aware I was lost. Ma'am, you've been reported as kidnapped by hostile Indians. I'm here to escort you safely back to civilization." The word hostile sent a ripple of tension through the Lakota warriors. Elena could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge, ready to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. "I appreciate your concern, Captain, but as you can see, I'm unharmed." Morrison's smile was cold as winter steel. "Miss Brooks, you've clearly been under duress. Sometimes captives develop confused loyalties. It's not uncommon. Now come along and we can discuss this safely back at the fort. And if I choose not to go, ma'am, that wouldn't be a choice. That would be evidence of how these savages have affected your thinking." The word savages hit the camp like a physical blow. Elena felt tense beside her, felt the warriors shifting into attack positions. Any second now, this was going to turn into a bloodbath. Elena stepped forward, placing herself directly between the two groups. "Captain Morrison, I need to speak with you privately. Miss Brooks, unless you want a lot of good soldiers to die today for no reason, you'll give me 5 minutes." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he dismounted and followed Elena to a spot midway between the groups, close enough for both sides to see, but far enough that their words wouldn't carry. "Captain," Elena said quietly, "I know what you're thinking, but these people saved my life. My wagon train was attacked by cavalry, a case of mistaken identity. These Lakota found the survivors and helped us. Ma'am, that's not what our scouts reported. Your scouts are wrong or lying. I don't know which, but I know what I lived through." Morrison studied her face carefully. "Miss Brooks, even if that's true, you can't seriously be thinking of staying with these Indians. They're primitives, heathens. They have nothing to offer a civilized woman." Elena felt anger flare in her chest. "These primitives have shown me more genuine kindness than I've seen in most civilized places. They've shared their food, protected me, treated me with respect. Respect." Morrison's voice rose. "Ma'am, you're talking about the same people who have been raiding our settlements, killing our families, and having their families killed in return." Elena interrupted. "Captain, this cycle of violence has to stop somewhere. Maybe it stops here today with us choosing understanding over bullets." Morrison's expression hardened. "Miss Brooks, I have orders to bring you back. I can do that gently or I can do it by force, but either way you're coming with me. And if these people try to protect me, then they'll be dealt with accordingly." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. Morrison wasn't here for a rescue. He was here for a fight. He wanted an excuse to attack the camp, and her rescue was just convenient justification. She glanced back at Lakota, who was watching the exchange with those dark eyes that missed nothing. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested ready on his weapon. He was preparing to fight for her. She realized this man who'd captured her, intending to break her spirit, was now ready to die defending her. The revelation hit her like lightning. Somewhere in the past 4 days, everything had changed. She was no longer Lakota's prisoner. She was under his protection, and more than that, she was choosing to be here. Elena turned back to Morrison with new resolve. "Captain, I'm going to make this very simple for you. I'm staying here voluntarily. These people haven't harmed me. They've helped me. If you try to take me by force, you'll be kidnapping me from people who have shown me nothing but kindness. Miss Brooks." Furthermore, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger, "if you attack this camp, you'll be murdering innocent families, women, children, old people. Is that really the kind of officer you want to be?" Morrison's face flushed red with anger and frustration. "Ma'am, you're clearly not thinking rationally. These savages have poisoned your mind somehow." "Captain Morrison." Lakota's voice cut through the air like a blade. He'd approached silently, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. He stopped just close enough to emphasize his superior height and build, but not close enough to seem overtly threatening. "The woman has spoken her choice," Lakota said in careful English. "She stays freely. No chains, no force, her choice." Morrison's hand moved toward his sidearm. "Indian, you're in no position to make demands." "No demands," Lakota replied calmly. "Just truth. You count 24 men, I count more than 40 warriors in these hills, all with rifles taken from your dead cavalry. You want fight, we give you fight. But you know when this day," Elena looked around and realized he was right. While her attention had been focused on Morrison, Lakota warriors had positioned themselves throughout the surrounding hills. They were outnumbered and surrounded, and Morrison was finally beginning to realize it. "You're making a mistake, Miss Brooks," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "When word of this reaches Washington, tell Washington whatever you like," Elena said firmly. "Tell them Elena Brooks chose peace over violence, understanding over hatred. Tell them she stayed with people who showed her what civilization really looks like." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through anger, frustration, and calculation. Finally, he turned on his heel and stalked back to his horse. "This isn't over," he called back as he mounted. "The army doesn't abandon its people to savages." "Neither do the Lakota," Elena replied quietly, but loud enough for him to hear. As the soldiers wheeled their horses and rode away in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, Elena felt the entire camp release its held breath. Children emerged from hiding places. Women came out of the caves, and warriors lowered their weapons. But Elena's attention was focused entirely on Lakota, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You chose to stay," he said finally. "Yes, even though they offered you freedom." Elena considered this. "They offered me what they called freedom, but I'm learning that real freedom might be something different entirely." Lakota was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the golden afternoon light. "My grandmother will want to speak with you," he said finally. "And you?" Something vulnerable flickered in his dark eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "I need to remember what I was trying to teach you and why." As he walked away, Elena realized that the test hadn't been hers at all. It had been his. And somehow in choosing to stay, in choosing them over her own people's offers of safety, she challenged everything he thought he knew about white people, about enemies, about the possibility of bridges between worlds. The breaking he'd promised had happened, but not to her spirit. Something had broken in his certainty, in his carefully constructed hatred, and in that breaking, Elena thought she glimpsed the first green shoots of something entirely new growing between them. That evening, as the sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Elena found herself sitting beside the river where she'd first seen the wolves. The water murmured softly over smooth stones, carrying the day's heat away toward distant mountains. She'd come here to think, to process what had happened with Captain Morrison and what it meant for her future. She wasn't alone for long. Lakota appeared like a shadow, moving so quietly she didn't hear him until he settled on a fallen log near the water's edge. He'd washed off his war paint, and in the gentle evening light he looked younger, more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the water flow and listening to the evening sounds of the prairie. Elena found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair moved in the evening breeze, the careful way he held himself as if always ready for danger. "You surprised me today," he said finally, his voice quiet. "How so?" Lakota picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. "When the soldiers came, I expected you to run to them to choose your own people." Elena considered this. "They weren't my people." "Not really, they were white like you." "Skin color doesn't make people family," Elena said gently. "Shared values do. Kindness does, the willingness to see each other as human." Lakota glanced at her, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Is that what you see when you look at us? Humans? What else would I see?" "Savages, animals, threats to be eliminated." His voice carried the weight of bitter experience. "That is what most white people see." Elena turned to face him fully. "Most Lakota probably see white people as threats to be eliminated too. Does that make it true for all of us?" Lakota was quiet for a moment, considering this. "You really believe we can be more than enemies?" "I believe we already are more than enemies. We're sitting here talking, aren't we? Sharing thoughts, trying to understand each other." "That's not what enemies do." "No," Lakota agreed slowly. "It's not." The silence stretched between them again, but it felt different now, charged with possibility and dangerous hope. Elena could feel something shifting in the space between them. Something that made her heart beat faster and her breath come shallow. "Tell me about your dreams, Elena Brooks," Lakota said suddenly. "Before the wagon train, before all this, what did you want from life?" The question caught her off guard. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I realize I know very little about you beyond the fact that you speak Lakota and don't break easily." Elena smiled at that. "I wanted to teach children to help them learn to read and write and think for themselves. I believe education can change the world one mind at a time. And now, do you still want those things?" Elena thought about the Lakota children who gathered around her, eager to learn English words and share their own language with her. "Yes, but maybe not in the way I originally imagined." Lakota leaned forward, interested. "What do you mean?" I mean, maybe the most important education happens when different peoples learn from each other. When we stop seeing differences as threats and start seeing them as opportunities to grow. You think our peoples could learn from each other? I think they already are. Your children are learning English from me. I'm learning Lakota customs from your grandmother. You're learning that not all white people are the same. I'm learning that not all warriors are heartless. Something flickered in Dakota's eyes at that last comment. Is that what you see when you look at me? Someone with a heart. Elena felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. I see someone who loves his people so much he was willing to destroy himself with grief rather than risk failing them. I see someone who gave a stranger a blanket because the nights were cold. Even though he was supposed to be breaking her spirit, Takakota's breathing had grown slightly uneven. Elena, I see someone, she continued softly, who lost his sister and decided to honor her memory by becoming everything she would have grieved to see. The words hit him like physical blows. Takakota flinched and turned away, his hands clenching into fists. You don't understand, he said roughly. Anna died because she was gentle, because she believed in peace. If I'm not hard enough, if I'm not strong enough, then what? More people die. More children grow up without fathers. More families torn apart by grief and revenge. Elena moved closer. Close enough to see the pain in his eyes. The way his carefully controlled expression was cracking. Takakota, your sister didn't die because she was gentle. She died because someone chose fear over understanding. Someone decided that killing was easier than talking. Don't honor her memory by becoming what killed her. For a moment, she thought he might lash out, might remind her harshly that she was still his prisoner, still here to be broken according to his plan. Instead, he turned to look at her with eyes that held such raw vulnerability it took her breath away. Then what do I become? He whispered. How do I protect my people if I'm not strong enough? Maybe, Elena said gently. Real strength isn't about being hard enough to break everything that threatens you. Maybe it's about being brave enough to try healing instead. They were sitting very close now, close enough that Elena could see the fine details of his face, could smell the sage smoke in his hair. Close enough that when he reached out tentatively to touch her cheek, she didn't pull away. You're changing everything, he said, his voice barely audible. Everything I thought I knew, everything I planned. Good, Elena breathed. Maybe everything needed to change. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to balance on the edge of possibility. Takakota's hand was warm against her skin, his dark eyes searching hers as if looking for permission, for some sign of what she wanted. Then the spell shattered as war cries echoed across the prairie. Takakota sprang to his feet, instantly transformed back into the warrior as flames bloomed on the horizon. Elena's heart sank as she realized what she was seeing. The cavalry had returned, but not alone. They'd brought fire. The winter camps, Takakota said grimly, his face hard as stone. Morrison is burning the empty villages upstream, trying to draw us out, make us choose between protecting you and Clear's throat, protecting our people's heritage. Elena felt sick. This is my fault, if I hadn't stayed. No. Takakota's voice cut through her guilt like a blade. This is what men like Morrison do. They create impossible choices and then blame others for the consequences. He turned to her, his expression fierce but no longer cold. Now you see what choosing us really means, Elena Brooks. Not just sitting by a peaceful river talking about healing, blood and fire and choices that will haunt you forever. Elena looked at the distant flames, then back at Takakota's face, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not just the grieving warrior or the gentle man by the river, but the leader who carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders. Then we'd better make sure we choose well, she said firmly. Something blazed into Dakota's eyes. Surprise, admiration, something that might have been love. You would fight beside us, even knowing what it means. Elena thought of the children who called her tree hair woman, of Ayana's patient teaching, of the way this camp had become more home to her in 4 days than anywhere she'd lived in years. I would fight for us, she corrected, for the possibility that different peoples can become one people. for the chance that love might be stronger than hate. Lakota stared at her for a moment that stretched like eternity. Then, without warning, he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with a desperation that spoke of last chances and new beginnings and everything they might build or lose in the coming darkness. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, the distant war cries were growing closer. "Stay close to me," Lakota said, his warrior's mask sliding back into place. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Elena nodded, her heart pounding with fear and determination and something that felt like destiny. As they ran back toward the camp to face whatever Morrison had brought against them, she realized that Dakota's promise to break her had been fulfilled, but not in any way either of them had expected. He'd broken her old life, her old assumptions, her old fears. And in that breaking, something stronger had emerged, something worth fighting for. The real test was just beginning. The attack came at dawn, just as Elena had feared it would. Morrison had spent the night positioning his men, and now they struck like a hammer blow against the waking camp. But this time he hadn't come with just cavalry. He'd brought artillery. The first cannon blast shattered the morning peace, sending a teepee up in flames and scattering families into chaos. Elena woke to screaming and gunfire, her heart hammering as she realized the nightmare had finally arrived. Lakota burst into the teepee, already painted for war, rifle in hand. "They're coming from 3 sides. We have maybe minutes before they overrun the camp." Elena was already moving, grabbing the few medical supplies she'd gathered and checking her own small revolver. A gift from Elena, who declared that any woman living with Lakota should know how to protect herself. "The children?" Elena asked. "Being moved to the sacred caves. It's the only place Morrison won't dare follow with artillery." Another cannon blast closer this time. Through the teepee walls, Elena could hear the thunder of approaching hoof beats, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the war cries of Lakota warriors meeting the attack head-on. "Elena," Lakota said, catching her arm as she moved toward the entrance. "You can still run. The path to the caves is clear. No one would blame you for choosing safety." Elena met his eyes, seeing fear there. Not for himself, but for her. This proud warrior who'd captured her to break her spirit was now terrified of losing her to the violence he couldn't prevent. "I told you yesterday," she said firmly, checking her revolver's chambers. "We face this together." Something blazed into Dakota's dark eyes. Pride, love, desperation, all mixed together. He pulled her close and kissed her hard, tasting of smoke and possibility and last chances. "Then stay behind me," he said against her lips. "And if I fall, you won't fall," Elena interrupted fiercely, "because I won't let you." They burst from the teepee into chaos. The camp was a maze of smoke and fire. Warriors and cavalry locked in deadly combat between burning shelters. Elena saw Bluehawk fall with a bullet in his shoulder, saw one of the women she'd worked with dragging 2 children toward the hills. "The Medicine Lodge," Lakota shouted over the noise. "Wounded are gathering there. Can you go?" Elena said, understanding immediately. "I'll help who I can." She ran toward the large teepee where the injured were being brought, her medical training taking over despite the terror clawing at her chest. Inside, she found chaos. Warriors with bullet wounds, women burned by flaming debris, children crying for parents who might not survive the day. Elena threw herself into the work, using everything she'd learned from books and battlefield experience to stop bleeding, set bones, ease pain where she could. Her hands moved automatically while her mind focused on one task at a time, blocking out the sounds of battle raging outside. She was binding a young warrior's chest wound when Elena appeared beside her. The old woman's eyes grim but determined. "Lakota fights near the horse corral," she said in rapid Lakota. "Morrison has trapped him there with 6 soldiers. He needs help." Elena's blood turned to ice. "Watch these wounded," she told Elena, grabbing her revolver and heading for the entrance. "Where are you going?" the old woman called. "To save your grandson." Elena ran through the smoke-filled camp, dodging stray bullets and burning debris. The horse corral was on the far side of the village, and she could see muzzle flashes from behind the wooden fence. Her heart hammered as she realized Lakota was outnumbered and pinned down, slowly being surrounded. She circled wide, using the chaos of battle as cover until she could approach the corral from behind. Through gaps in the fence, she could see Morrison himself directing the attack, his face twisted with ugly satisfaction as his men closed the trap. "Give it up, Indian," Morrison called. "You're finished. Surrender now, and I might let you live to see a reservation." "Come and take me, soldier," Takakota's voice replied, steady despite his desperate situation. "But know that dying free is better than living in chains." Elena's mind raced. 6 soldiers positioned around the corral, Takakota trapped in the center with limited ammunition, Morrison standing back, confident in his victory. She had maybe one chance to even the odds. She took careful aim and fired. Her bullet took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the fence. The soldiers whirled in confusion, trying to locate this new threat. "Behind you." Elena shouted to Takakota in Lakota, then dove for cover as return fire splintered the wood around her, but her diversion had worked. Takakota rolled left and came up firing, taking down 2 soldiers before they could react. The remaining 4 found themselves caught between 2 opponents. Their careful ambush turned into a deadly crossfire. Elena picked her shots carefully, using the revolver skills Ayana had insisted she learn. These weren't targets on a practice range. These were men trying to kill the person she'd come to love. She pushed down her natural reluctance to harm others and fought with the fierce determination of someone protecting her family. When the smoke cleared, Morrison lay wounded but alive. 3 of his soldiers dead and the rest in full retreat. Takakota appeared through the drifting gunzum smoke, blood trickling from a graze on his temple, but otherwise unharmed. "You came back for me," he said, wonder in his voice. "I told you we faced this together." The battle was turning with Morrison wounded and their artillery crew fled. The cavalry was in disarray. Lakota warriors pressed their advantage, driving the remaining soldiers back across the prairie in a route that would be talked about for generations. But Elena barely noticed the victory. Her attention was focused entirely on Takakota. On the way, he was looking at her as if she just performed a miracle. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You've saved mine every day since I've been here," Elena replied. "Saved it from loneliness, from purposelessness, from believing I had to choose between worlds instead of building bridges." Takakota reached for her, his hands gentle despite the violence they just survived. "Elena Brooks," he said formally, "I have something to confess." "What's that?" "I did break you as I promised. I broke your old life, your old fears, your old limitations. But in doing so, you broke something in me, the hatred that was consuming me from inside." Elena smiled, tears streaming down her face as she realized they'd both survived not just the battle, but the harder war they'd been fighting within themselves. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Takakota said, glancing around at the camp where Lakota and white captive had fought side by side, where 2 peoples had begun to see past their differences. "We built something new, something my sister would have been proud of." 3 months later, Elena stood in the center of the camp, watching children, both Lakota and white refugees from various conflicts, learning together in the school she'd started. Takakota had proven that peace was possible by example, negotiating safe passage for white families in exchange for trade agreements and mutual protection pacts. The transformation neither of them had expected was complete. The promise to break had become a vow to heal. The captive had become family. The warrior had become a peacemaker. And in the evening when they sat by the river, watching the sunset paint the prairie in golden crimson, Elena and Takakota planned a future where their children would grow up knowing that love was always stronger than hate. That understanding was always braver than fear. Takakota had kept his promise. He had broken her. But what they'd built from those broken pieces was more beautiful than anything either of them had dared to dream. The morning sun painted the expanded village in shades of gold and amber. As Elena stepped from the large cabin that had become both home and school, her belly, round with her second child, made her movements careful but unhurried. At 31, she had grown into her role as both teacher and cultural bridge, with a grace that surprised even her. The village had transformed beyond recognition since that desperate dawn when Captain Morrison's cannons had tried to tear apart everything they were building. Where once stood a traditional Lakota camp, now sprawled a unique community that belonged entirely to neither world, but somehow encompassed both. Log cabins sat beside traditional teepees. Gardens planted with both corn and European vegetables flourished under the careful tending of women who'd learned to share seeds and techniques across cultural lines. Children's laughter echoed in 3 languages: Lakota, English, and the hybrid tongue that was emerging naturally among the youngest generation, a linguistic bridge their parents could barely follow. Elena paused on her porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching the morning routine unfold. Near the river, Lakota was teaching a group of young men, both Lakota and white, advanced horsemanship techniques. His voice carried clearly across the distance, patient and firm as he corrected their posture and praised their progress. He'd grown into leadership the way a tree grows towards sunlight. Naturally, inevitably, the war paint was gone now, replaced by the quiet authority of someone who'd learned the true strength lay not in breaking enemies, but in building alliances. His hair, longer now in Clear's throat, often adorned with small gifts from the children he taught, caught the morning light as he demonstrated a particularly complex riding technique. Their first child, 3-year-old William Lakota, named for Elena's father and carrying his Lakota father's strength, toddled past chasing a patient camp dog, his chubby legs working hard to keep up. He was chattering in the fluid mixture of languages that had become his natural tongue, pointing at birds and flowers and declaring his grand plans for the day to anyone who would listen. "Mama, mama," he called, spotting Elena on the porch. "Ades says we go river today. Catch fish big like." Like he spread his arms wide, nearly toppling over with the effort. "Like a whale," Elena suggested in English, then repeated it in Lakota for the elderly woman sitting nearby who chuckled at the boy's enthusiasm. This was Ayana, Lakota's grandmother, now well into her 70s but still sharp as winter wind. She spent her days teaching the traditional stories to any child who would listen, weaving Elena's academic lessons seamlessly with Lakota wisdom until the children couldn't tell where one education ended and the other began. That boy has his father's imagination and his mother's determination, Ayana observed in the careful English she'd been practicing. The world will not know what to do with such a combination. Elena lowered herself carefully into the chair beside the old woman, grateful for the chance to rest. Teaching 23 children of varying ages and backgrounds was exhausting work, made more so by her advancing pregnancy. "Any word from the Eastern Territories?" she asked, nodding toward the letter Ayana held. "Good news," the old woman replied, her eyes twinkling. "The school in Kansas Territory wants to send teachers here to learn our methods. Seems word is spreading about what we've accomplished." Elena felt a warm glow of pride and satisfaction. What had started as her simple desire to teach had grown into something unprecedented, a model for how different cultures could not just coexist, but actively enrich each other. Educators from as far away as Boston were writing to request visits, wanting to understand how they'd achieved what government treaties and military force had failed to accomplish. The success hadn't come easily. Those first 2 years had been marked by constant challenges: suspicious visitors, bureaucratic interference, supply shortages, and the ever-present tension of building something entirely new while the world watched and waited for it to fail. There had been dark moments. The winter when disease swept through and Elena had worked herself to exhaustion nursing both Lakota and white families. The spring when a group of militant settlers had tried to rescue the white children, requiring Lakota's warriors to defend their chosen home with more force than they'd wanted to use. The summer when government officials had arrived with papers demanding the dissolution of their illegal mixed community. But each challenge had only strengthened their resolve and deepened their bonds. The disease outbreak had created lasting partnerships between Elena's medical knowledge and traditional Lakota healing practices. The settler attack had proven to the children that their community was worth fighting for. The government interference had resulted in an unprecedented legal recognition of their village as a special cultural preserve, the first of its kind in the territories. "Mama, look." William had returned, this time carrying a handful of wild flowers that were already wilting in his sweaty grip. "For baby." He patted Elena's belly with the gentle care of a child who'd been taught that the life growing there was precious and fragile. "Thank you, sweetheart," Elena said, accepting the crushed flowers with appropriate ceremony. "The baby will love them." As if summoned by the mention of the baby, Lakota appeared on the porch, moving with the quiet efficiency that had never quite left him despite years of peace. He'd been working with the horses, and the familiar scent of sage and leather clung to his clothes. "How are my girls today?" he asked, settling beside Elena and placing a gentle hand over hers on her belly. "Girls," Elena raised an eyebrow. "Pretty confident in your prediction, aren't you?" "Anna's dreams are never wrong," Lakota replied, grinning at his grandmother, who looked smugly pleased with herself. "She says this one will be a daughter who fights like her mother and thinks like her father." "Dangerous combination," Elena murmured, but she was smiling. Lakota's expression grew more serious as he watched their son playing in the dust with a carved horse. "I've been thinking about the future," he said quietly, "about what kind of world we're giving them." Elena studied his profile, seeing the weight of leadership that would always mark him. "What kind of world do you see?" "One where children like William don't have to choose between being Lakota or white, where they can be both and something new besides, where the color of someone's skin or the language they speak first doesn't determine whether they're seen as human." His voice carried the same note of passionate conviction that had first drawn Elena to him, back when that passion had been directed toward revenge rather than hope. "You think it's possible?" Elena asked. "Really possible, beyond just our little village?" Lakota was quiet for a moment, watching a group of children play a game that combined elements of both cultures into something entirely their own. 5 years ago, I would have said no. I would have said the hatred was too deep, the fear too strong. But look what we've built here, Elena. Look at what's possible when people decide that understanding is braver than fighting. As if to emphasize his point, a rider appeared on the horizon, a young Cheyenne brave carrying the staff that indicated a peaceful embassy. The sight of riders approaching no longer sent the village into defensive preparation. Word had spread throughout the territories that this was a place where conflicts were resolved with words rather than weapons. Another delegation, Lakota observed with satisfaction. "That's the third this month. The Cheyenne, the Crow, even some of the Dakota bands want to see how we've made this work." Elena felt the baby kick strongly, as if responding to the excitement in their voices. "She's going to be born into a very different world than we were," she mused. "Better or worse?" Lakota asked. Elena considered this, watching their sons share his toys with children whose grandparents had been mortal enemies. Seeing women from 3 different cultures working together to prepare the evening meal. Hearing the sound of languages blending and evolving into something new and beautiful. "Different," she said finally. "Complicated, full of possibilities we can't even imagine yet." Lakota lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "I love you, Elena Brooks," who became Elena Lakota, who became something neither of our peoples had words for. "I love you too, warrior who learned that the greatest victories come not from breaking enemies but from building bridges." As the sun climbed higher and the village stirred to full life around them, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that first moment when ropes had burned her wrists and Lakota had promised to break her through all the challenges and changes and small miracles that had followed. He had broken her just as he'd promised. Broken her free from a world too small for her dreams, too afraid for her courage, too limited for her love. And in that breaking, they discovered something unprecedented. That the strongest foundations are built not from unbroken stone, but from fragments that have learned to support each other. Their children would grow up in a world where such discoveries were possible, where bridges could be built across any divide, where love really could transform everything it touched. It was a good world to build. It was a beautiful legacy to leave, and it was only the beginning. And so Elena Brooks discovered that sometimes the most dangerous promises are the ones that come true in ways we never expected. Lakota had vowed to break her, and he did. But he broke her free from a world too small for her courage, too narrow for her compassion, too afraid to believe in the possibility of love transcending every boundary. Their story became legend on the frontier, whispered around campfires and passed down through generations. The white woman who chose the Lakota, the warrior who chose peace. The love that proved stronger than hatred and built bridges where others saw only walls. But perhaps the most beautiful part of their story wasn't the dramatic rescue or the battle won, but the quiet moments that followed. Elena teaching Lakota children to read while learning their mother's lullabies. Lakota negotiating trade agreements with former enemies, honoring his sister's dream of peace. Their own children growing up bilingual and bicultural, seeing difference as strength rather than threat. Elena never returned to the white world she'd left behind, but that world came to her. Settlers seeking safe passage. Soldiers learning that some battles are won with words rather than bullets. Teachers and missionaries discovering that the savage communities they'd come to civilize had wisdom to offer in return. The camp by the river became something unprecedented, a place where two cultures met not as conqueror and conquered, but as neighbors learning to share the same sky. Elena's school grew to welcome children from 3 tribes and half a dozen settler communities. Lakota's influence spread through the territory, as other leaders saw what was possible when courage chose cooperation over conflict. Years later, when their hair was silver and their grandchildren played the same games their own children had invented, mixing Lakota traditions with settler customs to create something entirely new. Elena and Lakota would still sit by that river at sunset, remembering the night when everything changed. "Do you ever regret it?" Lakota would ask sometimes, watching their granddaughter teach a group of mixed children to braid horsehair, choosing this life instead of the safety of your own people. And Elena would always smile, taking his weathered hand in hers. "My own people are right here," she'd say. "They always were. I just had to be broken open wide enough to see them." Their love story reminds us that the most powerful transformations begin not with grand gestures, but with the simple choice to see humanity in unexpected places. That sometimes being captured is really being set free. That sometimes the promise to break us becomes the invitation to become who we were always meant to be. In a world that often seems divided by fear and misunderstanding, Elena and Dakota's story whispers a different possibility. That love doesn't just conquer all, it transforms all, turning enemies into family and strangers into the missing pieces of our own hearts. Sometimes the most beautiful songs are born from the most broken places. Sometimes the strongest bridges are built by those brave enough to stand in the space between worlds and refuse to choose sides. Sometimes a promise to break becomes a vow to heal, and sometimes that's exactly what the world needs.